"What are you looking at, old man?" The voice cut across the morning stillness of the 1,000-meter range like a blade through silk. Sergeant Dylan Kraus stood with his arms crossed, his pressed utilities pristine, his confidence radiating from him in waves that made the other students turn and watch. The janitor had been standing there again. Same spot as yesterday. Same spot as the week before. Mop handle resting against his shoulder, bucket of gray water beside his worn boots. Pale blue eyes fixed on the distant targets, as if he could see something the rest of them could not. Clifton Mercer did not flinch at the words. He had heard worse in places where words were followed by bullets, in rooms where the wrong answer meant a body bag, in moments when staying calm was the only thing standing between life and a flag-draped coffin. He simply turned his weathered face toward the young sergeant and offered a response, so quiet it barely carried across the 5 meters between them. "Just watching the wind, Sergeant. Do not mean to be in the way." Kraus laughed. The sound was theatrical, designed to carry, meant to summon an audience. It worked. Staff Sergeant Terrence Womack drifted over from the adjacent shooting platform, a smirk already forming. 2 more students followed, then 3, until a small crowd had gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. "Watching the wind." Kraus repeated the words with exaggerated wonder. "You hear that, Womack? The cleaning guy is watching the wind. Like he knows what that means." Womack shook his head slowly. "Probably thinks if he stands here long enough, some of our skill will rub off on him." The laughter rippled through the group. Clifton absorbed it the way desert sand absorbs rain, without visible effect, without response. His hands remained still at his sides. His breathing did not change. 30 years of controlling his heart rate under conditions that would break most men had made him immune to verbal provocation from boys who had never truly been tested. But what Sergeant Kraus did not know, what none of them standing on that range could possibly understand, was that the old man with the mop had built this program. The techniques they studied, the positions they practiced, the standards they struggled to meet had all flowed from the mind of the janitor they now mocked. And in exactly 40 minutes, every shooter on that range would understand that some lessons cannot be taught in classrooms or written in manuals. Some lessons can only be witnessed. The morning sun climbed higher over the California hills, casting long shadows across the shooting platforms. Wind flags at the 300, 500, and 800-meter lines told their silent stories to anyone trained to read them. Clifton read them without conscious thought, the way a musician hears melody in random sounds, the way a poet finds rhythm in ordinary speech. 3 to 4 miles per hour from the right at the mid-range markers, shifting to a headwind component by 800, quartering slightly at the target line. He had made these calculations 10,000 times. His body remembered even when his mind tried to forget. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage and hidden valor and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Near the range entrance stood the record board, a slab of polished wood bearing brass plates engraved with the names of the finest shooters to ever pass through these gates. Kraus gestured toward it with obvious pride. "See that board, old-timer? That is where legends live. My name is going up there before I graduate. Top scorer in the class. Maybe top 10 all time." Clifton's eyes moved to the board. He knew every name on it, had trained half of them personally, had watched them grow from uncertain students into the kind of shooters who could change the outcome of battles with a single well-placed round. At the very top, etched in brass that had dulled slightly with the years, a name waited in patient silence. Monsieur n'y point hésité, si merci. Stillwater. Kraus did not make the connection. None of them did. Movement in the instructor tower caught Clifton's attention. A figure descended the metal stairs with the easy authority of a man comfortable in his domain. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Mercer, senior instructor, approached the growing crowd with a frown already forming. Clifton's heart seized in his chest. His son, 38 years old now, with his mother's patient eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. Wade had been searching for 3 years, checking shelters, checking morgues, hiring investigators. And here his father stood, 20 feet from his classroom, invisible in plain sight. Wade pushed through the students. "What's going on here? Leave the cleaning staff alone and get back on the line." Kraus straightened slightly, but held his ground. "Just having some fun, Gunny. The janitor has been watching us shoot for months. Figure we would see if he had any interest beyond staring." Wade glanced at the old man with the mop. Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of recognition that could not find its shape. The way the janitor stood, the stillness in his frame. It tugged at something deep in Wade's memory. But the aged face before him bore no resemblance to the photograph on his desk, to the legend he had spent 3 years mourning. Clifton kept his eyes down. He could not look at his son directly, could not risk the moment of recognition that would shatter the fragile architecture of his self-imposed exile. "It is no trouble, sir," he said softly. "I will move along." Wade froze. Something in the voice. Something in the automatic, sir, that carried decades of muscle memory. But he could not place it, and a moment passed like a cloud shadow over open ground. The crowd dispersed slowly. Kraus shot one final look of contempt at the janitor before returning to his platform. But Clifton did not move. His eyes lifted once more to the tower where his son had retreated, and in the silence of his breaking heart, he made a decision that would change everything. The desert wind carried memories the way it carried dust, settling them into places they did not belong, stirring them up when least expected. Clifton pushed his mop across the concrete floor of the equipment shed, but his mind had traveled decades backward to a place where the wind meant the difference between mission success and body bags. February 1991. The border between Kuwait and Iraq stretched before them like a scar across the earth. Staff Sergeant Clifton Mercer lay prone in a hide position scraped from the rocky soil, his ghillie suit blending with the terrain until he became indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Beside him, Corporal Rogelio Montoya pressed his eye to the spotting scope, his voice a steady whisper cutting through the tension. "Target confirmed. Republican Guard command element. Range 1747 meters. Wind from the right, 6 to 8, gusting to 12 at the midpoint. Mirage is heavy past 1200. Clifton made the adjustments without conscious thought. His hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, clicking the elevation turret, adjusting windage, settling the crosshairs on a figure whose death would disrupt enemy armor coordination for the entire sector. The shot was impossible by any conventional standard. Nearly a mile through shifting crosswinds and heat distortion that turned the distant target into a shimmering ghost. "Send it when ready," Rogelio whispered. The rifle spoke. The round traveled for nearly 3 seconds before finding its mark. The target dropped. For one perfect moment, the mission was complete. Then the world exploded. Their muzzle flash had been spotted. Rounds began impacting around their position, kicking up geysers of sand and stone. Rogelio rolled to return fire, covering Clifton's displacement from the hide. The crack of incoming rounds mixed with the bark of Rogelio's rifle in a symphony of violence that Clifton would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. The bullet caught Rogelio in the side, spinning him back into the rocks. Clifton was at his side in an instant, hands pressing against the wound, feeling the hot pulse of blood between his fingers. "Leave me," Rogelio gasped. "Get to extraction." Clifton did not respond with words. He hauled his spotter over his shoulders in a fireman's carry and began to move. 7 kilometers to the extraction point. 7 kilometers through hostile territory with a dying man on his back and enemy patrols hunting for them both. The helicopter was waiting when he arrived. Medics swarmed Rogelio the moment Clifton laid him on the deck. But the damage was too severe, the blood loss too great. Rogelio's hand found Clifton's and gripped with failing strength. "You made the shot," he whispered. "Now make a home." "That is an order, Staff Sergeant." His grip loosened, his eyes fixed on something beyond the helicopter's ceiling. And Clifton Mercer, the finest shooter of his generation, knelt beside the body of his brother, and felt something fundamental break inside him. The memory faded like smoke in wind. Clifton found himself standing motionless in the equipment shed, mop handle white-knuckled in his grip, tears cutting silent tracks through the dust on his face. He wiped them away with the back of his hand and resumed his work. The past could not be changed. The dead could not be brought back. All he could do was keep moving, one day at a time, one breath at a time. But Rogelio was not the only ghost who haunted him. Eleanor had entered his life like sunlight through storm clouds. An elementary school teacher with a laugh that could fill a room and eyes that saw past every wall he had built around himself. She understood his silences. She filled their home with warmth he could never generate on his own. She gave him 2 sons who grew up strong and good despite having a father who spent more time at war than at home. 34 years of marriage. 34 years of her voice being the first thing he heard each morning and the last thing he heard each night. 34 years of believing that maybe the violence had led to something worthwhile, that maybe he deserved the peace she brought him. Then came the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. 11 weeks from the first scan to the last breath. Clifton held her hand through every moment of it, watched her fade from the vibrant woman who had saved his soul into a shadow who could barely whisper his name. The reading glasses she wore while grading papers sat on a nightstand when she died, and he had carried them in his breast pocket every day since. Her final words still echoed in his memory. "Stay for the boys, Cliff. Promise me you will stay." He had promised, and he had broken that promise within 3 months of her burial. The grief had hollowed him out like artillery fire hollowing a building. He looked at Wade and saw Eleanor's patient eyes. He looked at Nathan and heard Eleanor's laugh in his voice. Every moment with his sons became a reminder of what he had lost, and the weight of it crushed him until he could not breathe. The note he left was simple. "Your mother was everything good in me. Without her, I am just the war. Live your lives. I love you." He had disappeared into the streets of San Diego, then drifted north, then found himself drawn back to the one place that felt like home. The Scouts Sniper School, the range where he had shaped legends. He applied for the janitor position under a name close enough to his own that the paperwork would not raise flags, but different enough that no one would make the connection. For 3 years he had swept these floors. For 3 years he had watched his son teach from a distance, had witnessed Wade become the instructor Clifton always knew he could be. For 3 years he had whispered to Eleanor in the darkness of his janitor's closet, telling her about their boys, apologizing for breaking his promise, asking for forgiveness he did not deserve. Now he stood in the equipment shed, surrounded by the tools of a craft he had mastered and abandoned, and wondered how much longer he could maintain the lie. Wade had looked at him today, had heard something in his voice. The walls were cracking, and Clifton did not know whether to fear their collapse or pray for it. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt like hell breath. Clifton walked the shooting platforms before dawn, picking up spent brass casings and depositing them in the bucket that hung from his belt. The ritual calmed him. Each piece of brass represented a shot taken, a lesson learned, a small step toward the precision that separated adequate shooters from exceptional ones. He had taught that lesson for 2 decades. Now he collected its remnants in silence. The 1,000-meter line stretched before him in the gray pre-dawn light. He paused there, looking downrange toward targets that were barely visible in the darkness. The wind was already speaking to him, telling its secrets through the subtle movement of brush and the angle of distant flags. For miles per hour from the northwest, shifting to a more direct crosswind by mid-range, with a slight quartering component to the target line. He calculated holdover and windage adjustments without conscious effort, the mathematics of precision shooting embedded so deeply in his mind that they had become instinct. Footsteps behind him broke the morning quiet. Clifton turned to find Sergeant Krause approaching with a predatory smile, Womack and 3 other students trailing behind him like wolves following their pack leader. The young sergeant's eyes held the gleam of someone who had planned something and was eager to see it unfold. "Early start, old man," Krause said, "almost like you were waiting for us." Clifton said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often served better than words, that letting an aggressor talk revealed more about their intentions than any interrogation could extract. Krause stepped closer. I have been thinking about you, about the way you watch us shoot, about the way you stand there like you know something we do not. And I figured out what it is. He paused for effect, clearly expecting Clifton to ask what he had figured out. When no question came, Krause continued anyway. You're one of those guys who washed out. Probably decades ago. Could not hack it, got sent home, and now you come back here to watch real shooters and pretend you were one of us. Am I close? The accusation hung in the air. Womack laughed. The other students shifted uncomfortably, some amused, others uncertain about the direction this confrontation was taking. Clifton's response came soft and measured. Never washed out of anything, Sergeant. Just here to do my job, right? Krause's smile widened. Your job, pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. Very important work. Tell me something, janitor. You ever actually fire a rifle? Or do you just like the sound they make? One of the students, a young woman named Okonkwo, spoke up from the back of the group. Maybe we should leave him alone, Krause. He is not bothering anyone. Krause turned on her with a flash of irritation. Nobody asked you, Okonkwo. This is between me and the cleaning staff. He returned his attention to Clifton, stepping close enough that the old man could smell the coffee on his breath. The confrontation had attracted more attention now. Other students were drifting toward the 1,000-meter line, curious about the commotion. In the instructor tower, movement suggested that someone had noticed the gathering. Here's what I think, Krause said, his voice carrying for the benefit of his growing audience. I think you have spent months standing around our range pretending you belong here. I think you bought some surplus gear somewhere and convinced yourself you were somebody. And I think it is time you either proved it or admitted what you really are. He reached into his cargo pocket and produced a rifle bolt, holding it up like a trophy. I signed out an M40A6 from the armory this morning. Told them I wanted some extra practice time. But I think we should let our friend here show us what he has got. Womack jogged toward the equipment shed, returning moments later with the rifle itself. He placed it on the shooting bench with ceremonial precision, then stepped back to watch the show. One shot, Krause announced to the crowd that had gathered. Cold bore, 1,000 meters, center mass on the silhouette. If the janitor here can make that shot, I will personally apologize for every word I have said and buy him lunch for a month. But if he misses, and he will miss because there is no way some mop jockey can shoot at this level, he admits he has been playing pretend and stops lurking around our range like a creep. The students murmured among themselves. Cold bore at 1,000 meters was a challenging shot even for trained snipers. For an untrained civilian, it would be effectively impossible. The dare was designed to humiliate, to provide entertainment at the expense of an old man who had no way to defend himself. Clifton looked at the rifle on the bench. The M40A6, a precision instrument he had helped develop, whose specifications he had argued over in endless meetings with armorers and engineers. His hands had not touched a rifle like it in 3 years. But the weight, the balance, the geometry of the platform, these things were written into his bones deeper than memory. In the instructor tower, Master Sergeant Aurelio Vega had noticed the commotion and was watching through binoculars. Something about the janitor's posture caught his attention. The way the old man stood, perfectly balanced, weight distributed with a shooter's instinct. It triggered a flicker of recognition that Vega could not quite place. Wade Mercer emerged from the classroom building, drawn by the crowd. He pushed through the students until he reached the center of the confrontation, his expression hardening as he assessed the situation. What the hell is going on here, Krause? Just a friendly challenge, Gunny. The janitor has been invited to demonstrate his skills. If he has any. Wade looked at the old man, at the rifle on the bench, at the expectant faces of his students. Protocol demanded he shut this down immediately. But something in the janitor's eyes stopped him. Something calm and measured and utterly without fear. Clifton met his son's gaze for the first time in 3 years. The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid, everything lost, everything that might still be found. It is all right, Clifton said quietly. One shot will not hurt anything. Wade opened his mouth to object, but the words died in his throat. The janitor was already moving toward the bench, toward the rifle, toward a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Wade Mercer sat alone in his classroom after the morning's disruption had dispersed. The students had returned to their scheduled training, Krause's challenge postponed until the afternoon when proper range safety protocols could be observed. But Wade could not focus on lesson plans or curriculum reviews. His mind kept circling back to the janitor, to the strange calm in the old man's eyes, to the voice that had triggered something deep in his memory. He opened his desk drawer and removed the photograph he kept there. Master Gunnery Sergeant Clifton Mercer in dress blues, medals arrayed across his chest like a history of violence and valor. The photo was 15 years old, taken at a ceremony where his father had received yet another commendation for excellence in training. The man in the picture stood straight and proud, his jaw set with the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered his craft and knew it. Wade traced the outline of his father's face with his fingertip. 3 years of searching. 3 years of dead ends and false leads, and nights spent wondering if the next morgue visit would finally provide the closure he dreaded. His mother's death had shattered something in his father, had broken the man who had survived 30 years of combat and training accidents and the weight of sending young men into harm's way. Wade understood grief. He lived with it every day, but he could not understand abandonment. His phone buzzed. Nathan's name appeared on the screen, calling from somewhere over the Pacific on his way to another deployment. Any news? His brother's voice carried the same exhausted hope it always did. Nothing. Wade leaned back in his chair. I thought I saw something today. One of the janitors on base. Something about the way he moved, the way he talked. For a second I thought maybe, but it was nothing. Just an old man. Nathan was quiet for a moment. We are going to find him, Wade. He is out there somewhere. Dad would not just disappear forever. Would he not? Wade heard the bitterness in his own voice and hated it. He left a note, Nathan. He chose to leave. Maybe he does not want to be found. That is not Dad. Nathan's response was immediate and fierce. Something broke in him when Mom died. But the man who raised us, the man who taught us everything we know, that man would not abandon his sons unless he convinced himself it was the only way to protect us. Wade closed his eyes. His brother was right. Their father had spent his entire life protecting others, training others, sacrificing for others. If he had left, it was because some twisted logic had convinced him that his absence was a gift rather than a wound. I have to go, Nathan said. Briefing in 10. But keep looking okay. Keep believing. He is out there. The call ended. Wade returned the photograph to his drawer and sat in the silence of his empty classroom, surrounded by training manuals and ballistic charts and the legacy of a man who had vanished like smoke and wind. Across the base, Clifton stood in his janitor's closet, a space barely large enough for a mop bucket and a folding chair. He had taped a photograph of Eleanor to the inside of the door, positioned so that her face was the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he saw each night. She smiled at him from the picture, frozen in a moment of joy that he could barely remember experiencing. I saw Wade today, he whispered to her image. Talk to him. He looked right at me and did not know. I do not know if that is a mercy or a punishment. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew her reading glasses, holding them carefully as if they might shatter at the slightest pressure. The lenses were smudged with fingerprints he could not bring himself to clean away. Her fingerprints, the last physical trace of her touch that remained in the world. The boys turned out good, Ellie, despite me. Because of you. Nathan is flying again, doing what he loves. Wade is teaching here, passing on everything I taught him and more. They are strong. They are whole. They do not need a broken old man dragging them down. He knew the words were lies even as he spoke them. He had seen the weight Wade carried, the shadows under his eyes, the way his son's shoulders tensed whenever someone mentioned family. The absence of a father was not a gift. It was a wound that refused to heal. But knowing and acting were different things. Clifton had spent 3 years convincing himself that distance was kindness, that his sons were better off mourning a memory than caring for ruin. The lie had become so familiar that he could almost believe it. He unfolded a worn notebook from his back pocket. The pages were filled with decades of handwriting, ballistic calculations, and wind data from 1,000 ranges in a dozen countries. Notes on students who had become legends. Observations about technique and temperament, and the invisible factors that separated good shooters from great ones. This notebook was his life's work, reduced to ink and paper that no one would ever read. He turned to a page near the back, where a different kind of entry waited. Names written in a careful hand, each one followed by a date. Rogelio Montoya, February 1991. Thomas Chun, August 1994. David Hollister, March 2003. The names continued down the page and onto the next, a roster of the dead that Clifton carried with him everywhere. He added no new names. There were no new names to add. The killing had stopped years ago, replaced by the slower death of watching others train for the violence he had left behind. But the old names still haunted him, still whispered in his dreams, still reminded him that survival was its own kind of burden. The afternoon sun slanted through the narrow window of his closet. Soon he would have to return to the range, to face the challenge Krause had issued, to either reveal himself or retreat deeper into invisibility. The rifle waited. The targets waited. And somewhere in the instructor tower, his son waited without knowing what he was waiting for. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete shooting platforms as students gathered for what Krause had begun calling the main event. Word had spread through the barracks and classrooms like wildfire, drawing spectators who had no official reason to be at the 1,000-meter range. They lined the observation area in clusters, some placing quiet bets, others simply curious to witness the humiliation of an old man who had wandered too close to a world where he did not belong. Clifton arrived with his mop and bucket, maintaining the fiction of his role until the last possible moment. He set his cleaning supplies beside the equipment shed and walked toward the shooting platform, where Krause waited with theatrical impatience. The M40A6 rested on the bench like a sleeping predator, its bolt locked open, its magazine empty, a single round waiting beside it on the worn wood. "About time," Krause announced to the crowd. "I was starting to think our janitor friend had reconsidered, decided maybe pushing a mop was more his speed after all." Laughter rippled through the gathered students. Clifton absorbed it without reaction, his pale eyes moving past Krause to the targets waiting at the end of the range. The wind had shifted since morning, now blowing from the southwest at 6 to 8 miles per hour, with stronger gusts at the mid-range markers, creating a complex ballistic environment that would challenge even experienced shooters. Lance Corporal Okonkwo stood apart from the main group, her expression troubled. She had tried twice to talk Krause out of this spectacle and had been dismissed both times. Now she positioned herself where she could see clearly, her phone ready in her pocket. Something told her this moment needed to be documented, though she could not have explained why. In the instructor tower, Master Sergeant Aurelio Vega adjusted his spotting scope to focus on the shooting platform below. He had been unable to shake the feeling that had nagged at him all morning, the sense that something about the janitor was deeply familiar. The way the old man walked, the economy of his movements, the stillness that surrounded him like a force field. Vega had seen these qualities before in a man who had shaped his entire career, but that man had vanished years ago and was presumed dead. Wade Mercer emerged from the classroom building and made his way to the range. Protocol demanded that an instructor supervise any live fire exercise, and despite his reservations about the entire situation, Wade would not allow his students to operate without proper oversight. He took his position near the shooting bench, clipboard in hand, his attention divided between safety concerns and the inexplicable pull he felt toward the old man who stood waiting. "All right," Krause said, plain to his audience. "Here are the rules. 1 round. Cold bore. 1,000 meters. You hit center mass on that silhouette. I apologize publicly and buy your meals for a month. You miss. You admit you have been pretending to be something you are not, and you stay away from our range. Fair enough?" Clifton nodded once. "Fair enough. Then let us see what you have got, old-timer." Krause gestured toward the rifle with exaggerated courtesy. "Whenever you are ready." The crowd fell silent as Clifton approached the bench. Every eye tracked his movements, waiting for the fumbling uncertainty of an untrained civilian handling a precision weapon for the first time. They expected hesitation. They expected confusion. They expected a quick and embarrassing end to this charade. What they got was something else entirely. Clifton picked up the rifle with a casualness that bordered on intimacy, his hands finding their positions without searching, his fingers wrapping around the grip with the familiarity of a musician taking up a beloved instrument. He checked the chamber with a smooth motion, confirmed the weapon was clear, then loaded the single round with a precision that made Womack's smile falter. In the tower, Vega leaned forward. His hands gripped the railing hard enough to turn his knuckles white. The way the janitor handled that rifle, the automatic safety check, the loading procedure executed with unconscious perfection. These were not the actions of an amateur. Clifton settled into position behind the rifle. His body adjusted itself with micro-movements so subtle they were nearly invisible, each one the product of 10,000 hours of practice refined over 30 years. His breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped. The world around him faded until nothing existed except the rifle, the wind, and the target waiting 1,000 meters downrange. Wade watched from his position near the bench, and the clipboard nearly slipped from his fingers. The stance, the position, the absolute stillness that had settled over the old man like a shroud. He knew this technique. He had studied it. He had taught it. It was called the Stillwater position, named for the legendary shooter who had developed it, and it was described in training manuals that Wade kept in his office. Manuals written by his father. His breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through impossibilities, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. The janitor could not be his father. His father was gone, lost somewhere in the vast indifference of a country that swallowed broken men without a trace. And yet the position was unmistakable. The stillness was unmistakable. Everything about the man behind that rifle screamed a truth that Wade was not ready to accept. Clifton's finger moved to the trigger. The crosshairs settled on the distant silhouette. The wind flags told their stories, and he listened with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning their language. One breath, one heartbeat, one moment of perfect clarity. "Send it," he whispered. The rifle cracked, and the sound rolled across the range like thunder announcing a storm. Every eye followed the invisible path of the bullet, tracking its trajectory through heat shimmer and crosswind toward the distant silhouette. The round traveled for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, less than 2 seconds passed between trigger pull and impact. The target rocked backward on its stand. Center mass. Perfect. Silence descended on the range with the weight of a physical force. No one moved. No one spoke. The impossible had just occurred, and the witnesses needed time to process what their eyes had shown them. Kraus stared downrange with his mouth hanging open. The confident smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of blank incomprehension. He had expected fumbling. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected to walk away from this moment with his superiority confirmed and his ego fed. Instead, he stood frozen, watching an old janitor rise from behind a rifle that had just delivered a shot most trained snipers would struggle to replicate. Womack took an involuntary step backward, as if distance might somehow change what he had witnessed. The other students exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to awe, their assumptions crumbling like sand castles before a rising tide. Okonkwo had her phone out now, recording everything. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept the camera steady. Whatever was happening here, she knew instinctively that it mattered. That it would matter to people beyond this range, beyond this moment, beyond anything she could currently understand. In the instructor tower, Vega had stopped breathing. His binoculars remained pressed to his eyes, but he was no longer looking at the target. He was looking at the shooter, at the way the old man rose from prone position with fluid grace, at the way he cleared the weapon with automatic precision, at the way he stood beside the rifle as if he had done so 10,000 times before. Because he had. because Vega had watched him do exactly this in this exact place more than 2 decades ago. The binoculars fell from Vega's hands. They clattered against the tower railing and tumbled to the floor, but he did not notice. He was already moving toward the stairs, his legs carrying him downward with an urgency that bordered on desperation. His mind cycled through impossibilities, each one more staggering than the last, until only one conclusion remained. Wade stood rooted to his position near the shooting bench. The clipboard had fallen from his fingers at some point, though he could not remember releasing it. His eyes were fixed on the janitor, on the old man who had just demonstrated a level of expertise that should not exist outside of legend. The Stillwater position, the cold bore accuracy, the unconscious precision of every movement. Wade had spent his entire career studying these techniques, teaching them to others, honoring the legacy of the man who had created them. His father, the ghost he had been chasing for 3 years. The janitor turned, and for one endless moment, their eyes met. Wade saw past the weathered skin and the gray stubble and the years of hard living written across that face. He saw the jaw he had inherited. He saw the pale blue eyes that looked back at him from every mirror. He saw the truth he had been too blind to recognize despite standing within arm's reach of it for months. His lips formed a word, but no sound emerged. His throat had closed around the name he wanted to speak, choking it before it could escape. Vega burst from the base of the tower and sprinted across the range, pushing past students who scattered at his approach. He skidded to a halt in front of the janitor, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with recognition. Stillwater. The word came out broken, shattered by emotion that Vega could not contain. The call sign hung in the air like a prayer, like an invocation, like the naming of something sacred that had been lost and was now found. Clifton closed his eyes. The moment he had dreaded for 3 years had arrived, summoned by a single shot that had traveled 1,000 meters to demolish the walls he had built around himself. "Master Sergeant," he said quietly, "it has been a long time." Vega's composure shattered completely. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the man who had shaped his entire career, the instructor who had transformed him from an uncertain student into one of the finest shooters the Marine Corps had ever produced. "We thought you were dead, sir." The words came out choked, barely intelligible. 3 years. We looked everywhere. How are you here? How are you alive? The crowd had gone absolutely still. Students who moments ago had been laughing at an old janitor now stood in stunned silence, watching their senior instructor weep before a man in stained khakis and worn boots. Krause's face had drained of all color. His eyes moved from Vega to the janitor to the record board near the range entrance, where the name at the top suddenly carried a weight he had never bothered to consider. Monsieur n'y point hésité, si merci. Stillwater, the janitor, the legend, the same man. His knees buckled slightly, and only Womack's hand on his arm kept him upright. The magnitude of what he had done, the mockery he had heaped upon this man, crashed over him like a wave of ice water. But Clifton was not looking at Krause. He was not looking at Vega. His eyes had found Wade, still standing frozen near the shooting bench. And in his son's face, he saw the collision of grief and recognition and something that might have been hope struggling to survive beneath layers of pain. "Wade," he said. Just the name. Just the single word that carried the weight of 3 years of silence and a lifetime of love he had never known how to express. Wade's paralysis broke. He took one step forward, then another, then he was running. Wade covered the distance between them in seconds that stretched like hours. His boots pounded against the concrete, each footfall driving him closer to the impossible truth standing before him. The crowd parted without being asked, students stumbling out of his path as if pushed by an invisible force. He stopped an arm's length from the janitor, from his father, from the ghost he had been chasing across 3 years of empty shelters and unclaimed bodies and sleepless nights spent wondering if the next phone call would bring the closure he dreaded. 3 years. The words tore from Wade's throat like broken glass. 3 years I have been looking for you, checking every shelter in California, every morgue, every VA hospital. I hired private investigators. I called in favors from every Marine I ever served with. And you were here? Clifton did not look away. He absorbed his son's anguish the way he had absorbed Krause's mockery, without flinching, without defense. He deserved this. He had earned every word of it. You were here, Wade repeated. His voice cracked on the second word. 20 feet from my classroom, sweeping floors, emptying trash cans. For how long? How long have you been watching me without saying a word? 3 years. Clifton's answer came quiet and steady, though something in his chest was breaking with each syllable. Since 6 months after your mother died. The admission hit Wade like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, his hands coming up to grip his own head as if trying to hold his thoughts together. 6 months. You left us a note saying you could not stay. You disappeared. We buried Mom. And then we had to mourn you too, not knowing if you were alive or dead. And 6 months later you came back here, to this place, to watch me from 20 feet away and never say anything? I thought you would be better without me. The words sounded hollow, even as Clifton spoke them. I looked at you and Nathan, and all I could see was her. Every time I heard your voice, I heard hers. I cannot breathe. I cannot function. I thought if I stayed, I would drag you both down with me. Wade's hands dropped to his sides. His fingers curled into fists that trembled with the effort of restraint. Better? You thought we would be better? Dad, we fell apart. Nathan threw himself into deployment after deployment, volunteering for every dangerous mission he could find because he did not want to be stateside, where everything reminded him of what we lost. I buried myself in teaching because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. We needed you. We needed our father. And you were here, hiding, convincing yourself that abandonment was some kind of gift. The students watched in silence that bordered on reverence. They had come to witness a humiliation and instead found themselves present at something far more raw and real. Krause stood frozen, his earlier arrogance evaporated, his face a mask of dawning horror as he understood exactly what his mockery had precipitated. Vega remained nearby, tears still tracking down his weathered cheeks. He had trained under this man, had learned everything he knew about precision and patience and the art of the impossible shot from the legend, now standing broken before his own son. To see Stillwater reduced to this, to see the greatest instructor of his generation revealed as a janitor hiding from his own children, was almost more than he could bear. Clifton reached into his breast pocket and withdrew Eleanor's reading glasses. He held them in his palm like a sacred relic, the smudged lenses catching the afternoon light. She made me promise, he said softly, before she died. She made me promise to stay for you boys. I cannot keep that promise. I tried. God knows I tried. But every morning I woke up and she was not there, and the weight of it crushed me until I could not move, until I could not think, until the only thing that made sense was disappearing. He looked at the glasses, then back at his son. I thought I was protecting you. I know now that I was only protecting myself, from the pain of seeing her in your faces, from the responsibility of being a father when I could barely be a person. I was a coward, Wade. The man who trained snipers and led missions and carried his dying brother 7 kilometers through hostile territory was too much of a coward to face his own grief. Wade's fists unclenched. The anger in his eyes shifted, softened by something that might have been understanding or might have been the first fragile stirring of forgiveness. You carried Rogelio for 7 kilometers, he said. His voice had lost its edge, though the pain remained. I grew up hearing that story. The famous shot, the impossible extraction. Stillwater, the legend who never left a man behind. Clifton nodded slowly. But you left us behind. Wade's words were not an accusation anymore. They were a statement of fact, heavy with sorrow. Your own sons. You left us behind. The truth of it hung between them, undeniable and devastating. Clifton had no defense to offer, no explanation that could justify what he had done. He had failed the 2 people who needed him most, and no amount of legendary marksmanship could balance that scale. I know, he said, and I am sorry. I am so sorry, Wade. I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not deserve forgiveness. I just need you to know that leaving was never about not loving you. It was about loving you too much to watch myself destroy you. Wade stood motionless for a long moment. The range around them had ceased to exist. The watching students, the California sun, the distant targets, all of it had faded into irrelevance. There was only a father and a son, separated by 3 years of silence, connected by a bond that abandonment had wounded but not severed. Then Wade moved forward and wrapped his arms around the old man who had taught him everything he knew about shooting and nothing about how to say goodbye. The embrace lasted long enough for the world to shift on its axis. Clifton felt his son's arms around him, felt the strength in that grip, felt something thaw in his chest that had been frozen solid since the day he walked away from everything that mattered. His own arms came up slowly, uncertain at first, then tightening with a desperation he could no longer hide. Wade's shoulders shook. The gunnery sergeant who commanded respect from every student on this range, who had inherited his father's precision and his mother's patience, wept against the shoulder of an old man in a janitor's uniform. The tears soaked through the stained khaki, and Clifton did not care. He held his son the way he should have held him 3 years ago, the way he should have held him at Eleanor's funeral, the way a father holds a child when the world has broken them both. Around them, the range remained frozen in collective shock. Students who had come to laugh at an old man's humiliation now witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Some had tears on their own cheeks. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the janitor they had dismissed with the legend whose name topped the record board and whose techniques filled their training manuals. Vega approached slowly, giving the reunion space but unable to stay away entirely. When Wade finally released his father and stepped back, wiping his face with the back of his hand, Vega spoke with a voice still rough with emotion. "Sir, I need to report this to Colonel Reeves. She served under you, back when she was a lieutenant. She has kept your training protocols intact all these years. She needs to know you are alive." Clifton nodded wearily. The exposure he had avoided for 3 years had come crashing down in the span of minutes. There was no hiding now, no retreating to his closet with Eleanor's photograph and his whispered confessions. The truth was out, spreading through the gathered crowd like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Okonkwo lowered her phone, the recording complete. She had captured everything from the shot to the reunion, and she knew without being told that this footage would travel far beyond the boundaries of the base. The world had a hunger for stories like this, for moments of revelation that reminded people of the hidden depths in those they overlooked. Krause had not moved from his position near the equipment shed. His face had cycled through shock and horror and shame, finally settling on something that looked like devastation. The magnitude of what he had done pressed down on him with suffocating weight. He had mocked a legend. He had challenged a man whose accomplishments dwarfed anything Krause could hope to achieve in 3 lifetimes. He had forced a father to reveal himself to a son who had spent years searching for him. He took one unsteady step forward, then another. The crowd parted for him as it had parted for Wade, though for very different reasons. When he reached the place where Clifton stood with his son, Krause's legs gave out entirely. He dropped to his knees on the concrete, his head bowed, his hands pressed flat against the ground. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Mercer." The words came out strangled, barely audible. "I did not know. I swear I did not know. I looked at you and saw an old man with a mop, and I thought I was better than you. I thought you were nothing, and you were everything. You built this program. You trained the people who trained me. Everything I know, everything I'm trying to become, it all started with you." Clifton looked down at the young sergeant kneeling before him. He saw himself in that arrogance, in that certainty, in that desperate need to prove superiority through the diminishment of others. He had been that young once. He had learned, through blood and loss and the weight of bodies carried through hostile terrain, that true strength never needed to announce itself. "Get up, Sergeant." His voice carried the authority of 30 years in uniform, the command presence that no amount of stained khaki could disguise. A man does not kneel for making a mistake. He stands and he learns from it. Krause raised his head. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet. "How can you even look at me after what I said? After what I did? Because I have said worse and done worse. Clifton extended a hand downward, because everyone who has ever held a rifle started somewhere, and most of us started as fools who thought skill made us superior. The measure of a man is not whether he falls. It is whether he gets back up and does better. Kraus took the offered hand and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. He stood unsteadily, unable to meet Clifton's eyes. "I will spend the rest of my career trying to earn back what I destroyed today," he said quietly. "Then you have already started to learn." Clifton released his hand. "The rest is just practice." Wade watched this exchange with something shifting in his expression. The father he remembered had always been hard, demanding, precise in his expectations, and sparing with his praise. This man, this weathered survivor who had just shown mercy to someone who deserved none, was someone Wade did not fully recognize. "Dad," he said softly, "when did you become this person?" Clifton turned to his son. The question cut deeper than any accusation could have. "When I lost everything," he answered. "When her mother died, and I realized that all the skills I'd spent my life developing could not save the one person who mattered most. When I spent 3 years sweeping floors and watching you teach, and understanding that pride and reputation mean nothing compared to the people we love." He reached out and placed a hand on Wade's shoulder. "I wasted 3 years hiding from that truth. I do not intend to waste another day." The news reached Colonel Patricia Reeves before Vega could make his report. A young lance corporal had witnessed the scene on the range and sprinted to headquarters with the kind of urgency usually reserved for enemy contact. By the time Vega arrived at her office, she was already halfway out the door. She crossed the base at a pace that forced her aide to jog to keep up. 23 years had passed since Lieutenant Reeves had stood on this same range, struggling with wind calls and trigger control, certain she would wash out before completing the course. A master gunnery sergeant with pale blue eyes and infinite patience had spent 3 extra hours with her every evening, breaking down her mistakes, rebuilding her technique, refusing to let her quit when quitting seemed like the only reasonable option. She had built her entire career on the foundation he laid. When she took command of the Scout Sniper School, her first act had been to ensure his training protocols remained untouched, preserved exactly as he had written them. The man had vanished 3 years ago, presumed dead by most who knew him, mourned by a community that understood what his loss represented. And now he was standing on her range in a janitor's uniform. The crowd parted as she approached. Students snapped to attention out of instinct, though her focus was entirely on the weathered figure standing beside Gunnery Sergeant Mercer. She stopped 3 feet away, her eyes traveling over the stained khaki, the worn boots, the face that time and grief had transformed but could not disguise. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Mercer." Her voice carried the weight of 2 decades of gratitude and 3 years of grief. "I thought I would never see you again." "Colonel." Clifton straightened slightly, muscle memory pulling his shoulders back, even after years of deliberately poor posture. "It appears I am harder to get rid of than anyone expected." Reeves closed the distance between them and did something that made every student present draw a sharp breath. She embraced him. The commanding officer of the Scout Sniper School, a full-bird colonel with combat deployments and commendations covering an entire wall of her office, wrapped her arms around a man in janitor's clothing and held on, as if letting go might cause him to disappear again. "You stubborn, impossible man," she said into his shoulder. "Do you have any idea what your disappearance did to the people who loved you, to the community you built? I am beginning to understand." Clifton's voice was rough. "I am beginning to understand a great many things." She released him and stepped back, composing herself with visible effort. Her eyes moved to Wade, taking in the tear tracks on his face, the protective stance he had assumed beside his father. "Gunnery Sergeant Mercer," she said formally, "I assume you have questions that require answers." Wade nodded slowly. "About 3 years' worth, ma'am." "Then let us get your father somewhere more appropriate than the middle of firing range." She turned to address the gathered crowd, her command voice cutting through the residual shock. "This training day is concluded. All students will return to barracks for the remainder of the afternoon. What you witnessed here today stays on this base until I determine otherwise. Dismissed." The students dispersed with reluctant obedience, casting backward glances at the small group that remained. Kraus lingered longer than the others, his eyes fixed on Clifton with an expression that mixed shame with something approaching reverence. Womack had to physically guide him away from the range. Okonkwo hesitated at the edge of the dispersing crowd. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, weighted with footage that could reach millions within hours of being posted. She thought about the story it would tell, about the janitor revealed as a legend, about the father found by a searching son. Then she thought about what Colonel Reeves had said, about what the families still standing on the range might need before the world came crashing in. She deleted the video. The act felt like sacrifice and gift simultaneously. Some stories belong to the people who lived them before they belonged to the world. This family had been broken long enough. They deserved time to heal before becoming content for strangers to consume. Vega remained with the group as they walked toward the headquarters building. He fell in a step beside Clifton, matching the older man's pace. "Sir, I have to ask, why here? Of all the places you could have gone, why come back to the school?" Clifton was quiet for a long moment. The question deserved honesty, even if honesty meant exposing wounds he had spent 3 years trying to ignore. "Because this is the only place I ever felt like I knew what I was doing," he finally answered. "I cannot be a husband anymore. I cannot be a father. But I could still see this range, still watch the students learn, still remember a time when my life made sense. It was selfish. I know that now. I was hiding in the one place that let me pretend I still had value while avoiding everyone who actually needed me." Wade listened without interrupting. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the mystery that had consumed his life for 3 years. His father had not fled into oblivion. He had fled to the only home he had left, even if that home required him to become invisible to survive within it. They reached the headquarters building. Reeves held the door open, gesturing for the others to enter. "We have much to discuss," she said, "about what happens next, about what role you might play here if you choose to stay. But first, I'd imagine there are phone calls to be made." She looked at Wade. "Your brother deserves to know his father is alive." The conference room in headquarters had hosted countless briefings, strategy sessions, and career-ending conversations. Today, it held something far more fragile. Wade sat beside his father at the polished table while Colonel Reeves arranged a secure video connection to a carrier somewhere in the Pacific. The screen flickered to life, and Captain Nathan Mercer appeared in his flight suit, clearly pulled from a briefing of his own. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation at the unexpected interruption. "Wait, what is going on? I am wheels up in 90 minutes and my CEO is asking why I got yanked for a personal call." Wade could not find the words. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times during 3 years of searching, had imagined how he would deliver the news if it ever came. Now that the moment had arrived, language failed him entirely. Clifton leaned forward into the camera's view. Nathan, just a name, just the single word that carried the weight of everything he had failed to say for 3 years. The color drained from Nathan's face. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He stared at the screen as if seeing a ghost, which in many ways he was. "Dad?" The word came out broken, a child's voice emerging from a grown man's throat. "Dad, is it you?" "It is me, son. I am alive. I am here." Nathan's hand came up to cover his mouth. His eyes glistened in the harsh fluorescent lighting of whatever ready room he occupied. For a long moment, he simply stared, his chest heaving with breaths that seemed inadequate to sustain him. 3 years. His voice cracked on each word. 3 years, Dad. We thought you were dead. I have been flying combat missions trying not to think about the fact that both my parents were gone. Where have you been? What happened to you? Clifton absorbed the questions like body blows, each one deserved, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had prepared himself for Wade's anger, had braced for the confrontation on the range. But seeing Nathan's face, seeing the raw devastation of a son who had given up hope, shattered something in him that he had thought already broken beyond repair. "I was hiding," he said. The truth came easier now, stripped of the excuses he had constructed to protect himself. "After your mother died, I could not function. I looked at you boys and saw her everywhere. I convinced myself that disappearing was the kindest thing I could do, that you would heal faster without a broken man weighing you down. Nathan shook his head violently. The kindest thing? Dad, I've spent 3 years wondering if you were dead in a ditch somewhere. Wondering if I would get a call from some coroner asking me to identify a body. Every time my phone rang at odd hours, I thought this is it. This is when I find out. I know. Clifton's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I know what I put you through. I know what I put both of you through. There is no excuse for it. There is no justification. I failed you in the worst possible way, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make it right. Wade reached over and placed his hand on his father's arm. The gesture was small, but significant, a physical declaration that whatever had been broken might still be repaired. Where are you? Nathan demanded. Where has he been, Wade? Wade took a breath. He has been here, Nathan. At the school. Working as a janitor. For almost 3 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathan stared at the screen, processing information that refused to assemble into anything coherent. A janitor. His voice was flat, disbelieving. Master Gunnery Sergeant Clifton Mercer, Stillwater, the most decorated instructor in the history of the Scout Sniper program, has been working as a janitor at his own school. I needed to be somewhere that made sense, Clifton said. Somewhere I could watch without being seen. Your brother has been teaching here, passing on everything I taught him. I watched him become the instructor I always knew he could be. I watched from 20 feet away and never said a word because I was too much of a coward to face what I had done. Nathan's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and he made no effort to hide them. His shoulders shook with sobs that 3 years of military discipline could not contain. I thought I would never see you again, he managed between ragged breaths. I thought I would have to spend the rest of my life without either of my parents. And you were there the whole time. You were right there. I am sorry, Nathan. The words were inadequate, laughably small against the magnitude of the wound. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. Nathan wiped his face with the back of his hand, struggling to regain control. When you get back stateside? 2 weeks. Nathan's voice steadied slightly. We are wrapping up this deployment and rotating home. Then I will be here, Clifton said. I'm not hiding anymore. I am not running. When you get home, I will be waiting. Nathan nodded slowly, the motion visible even through the imperfect video connection. You better be, because if you disappear again, I will spend the rest of my career hunting you down. And I am a very good pilot. The ghost of a smile crossed Clifton's weathered face. I would expect nothing less. I have to go, Nathan said reluctantly. They're calling my flight. But Dad, I need you to know something. He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes locked on his father's face. I am angry. I am so angry I can barely see straight. But underneath all of that, I am grateful. Grateful that you are alive. Grateful that Wade found you. We're going to have a lot of hard conversations when I get home, but we're going to have them together. As a family. The screen went dark. Clifton sat motionless, staring at the space where his younger son's face had been. Wade squeezed his arm. That went better than I expected. Clifton turned to look at his firstborn. Your brother always did have your mother's capacity for forgiveness. I never understood where it came from. I certainly did not teach it to him. Maybe not, Wade said quietly. But you taught him everything else. And now you have a chance to teach him what you learned while you were gone. And what is that? Wade met his father's eyes. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop running and let the people who love him help carry the weight. The days following the revelation moved with a strange mixture of urgency and stillness. Clifton found himself transferred from the janitor's closet to a guest quarters on base, a small room with a real bed and a window that looked out over the range where he'd spent 30 years building something that outlasted him. He slept poorly that first night, unaccustomed to mattresses after 3 years of concrete floors and folding cots. Colonel Reeves convened a meeting on the 3rd day to discuss what came next. The conference room held a small group now. Reeves at the head of the table, Vega to her right, Wade beside his father, and a representative from Veteran Services who had driven down from Los Angeles when word reached the right ears. The Marine Corps takes care of its own, Reeves began. Master Gunnery Sergeant Mercer, your service record speaks for itself. 30 years of distinguished duty, multiple combat deployments, the creation of training protocols still in use across every branch. Your disappearance was logged as voluntary separation, not desertion. There are no legal barriers to your reintegration. The Veteran Services representative, a woman named Torres with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. We have resources available. Housing assistance, medical care, counseling. Whatever you need to transition back into stable living. Clifton listened without responding immediately. 3 years of invisibility had taught him to be suspicious of help offered freely. But the faces around this table were not offering charity. They were offering recognition of debts unpaid, of service rendered, of a man who had given everything and asked nothing in return. I have a proposal, Reeves said. She slid a folder across the table. We are establishing a new program here at the school. Veteran reintegration through mentorship. Former service members struggling with transition would come here, work alongside active duty personnel, receive counseling and support while contributing their experience to the next generation. She met Clifton's eyes directly. I want you to lead it, not as a janitor, as the founding director. Your story, your survival, your willingness to come back from the edge, that is exactly what these men and women need to see. Proof that it is possible to fall completely and still find your way home. The room fell silent, waiting for his response. Wade watched his father's face, searching for signs of the retreat that had defined the past 3 years. Instead, he saw something he had not expected. Consideration. Genuine engagement with the possibility of purpose beyond mere survival. I'm not a counselor, Clifton said slowly. I'm a shooter. I know how to train men to kill. I'm not certain I know how to train them to live. Vega spoke up for the first time. Sir, with respect, you already did. Every student you ever taught carries something of you with them. Not just the technical skills, the discipline, the patience, the understanding that precision requires calm, and calm requires knowing who you are and why you are here. You taught us how to be still inside ourselves. That is exactly what broken veterans need to learn. Clifton looked at his former student, at the man who had become a master sergeant by applying lessons learned decades ago on this same range. The continuity of it struck him with unexpected force. His teaching had not ended when he put down his rifle. It had continued through everyone he had ever trained, spreading outward in ripples he could not see, but that had shaped careers and saved lives. Wade placed a hand on his father's shoulder. You spent 3 years punishing yourself for surviving. Maybe it's time to use that survival for something. The words echoed what Clifton himself had said to Krause on the range. The measure of a man is not whether he falls. It is whether he gets back up and does better. He had offered that wisdom to a young sergeant drowning in shame. Now his own son was offering it back to him. He thought of Rogelio bleeding out in a helicopter over Kuwait, ordering him to make it home. He thought of Eleanor, her last breath spent making him promise to stay for the boys. He had failed that promise for 3 years. But promises could be kept late. Debts could be paid with interest. The dead did not keep score, but the living still needed what the dead had asked for. I will need help, he said finally. I cannot do this alone. Reeves nodded. You will have it. Full staff support, funding from the Veteran Affairs budget, access to every resource this school can provide. And I want Krause assigned to the program as a volunteer coordinator. The request surprised everyone at the table, including Clifton himself. The words had emerged without conscious planning, but they felt right as soon as he spoke them. Sergeant Krause? Reeves raised an eyebrow. The young man who publicly humiliated you? The young man who publicly learned a lesson he will never forget. Clifton's voice carried quiet certainty. He has potential. He just needs to understand that strength means lifting others up, not pushing them down. This program can teach him that if he is willing to learn. Wade smiled slightly. The father he remembered had always seen potential where others saw problems. That quality, at least, had survived the years of exile. I will speak with him, Reeves said, but I suspect he will agree before I finish the sentence. She stood, signaling the end of the formal meeting. Master Gunnery Sergeant Mercer, welcome back to the Scouts Sniper School. She extended her hand. We have missed you more than you know. Clifton rose and took her hand. The grip was firm, professional, carrying decades of shared history. "It is good to be home, Colonel." He meant it in ways he was only beginning to understand. It is good to finally be home. 6 weeks later, the California sun hung low over the hills as Clifton stood on the back porch of Wade's house. The view stretched across a valley dotted with oak trees and golden grass, the kind of landscape Eleanor had always loved. He held a glass of iced tea in hands that had steadied considerably since the day on the range, though they still trembled slightly when he thought too hard about everything he had almost lost. The screen door creaked behind him. Nathan stepped onto the porch, 2 weeks home from deployment, still adjusting to solid ground after months at sea. He moved to stand beside his father, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They had talked for hours over the past weeks. Hard conversations, as Nathan had promised. Conversations about abandonment and grief and the impossible weight of watching someone you love disappear into themselves. There had been anger. There had been tears. There had been silences that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before breaking into something that felt like understanding. "Wade keeps asking if I want to transfer to a training squadron," Nathan said. "Stay stateside. Be closer to family. What do you want?" Nathan considered the question. "I want to fly. It is who I am, the same way shooting is who you are. But I also want to be here. I want to make up for the years we lost." Clifton nodded slowly. "You could do both. Your mother always said the Mercer men were too stubborn to choose between the things they love. We just find ways to have all of it." Nathan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face into something that looked remarkably like Eleanor. She was right about most things. She was right about everything. I just took too long to realize it. The screen door opened again. Wade emerged with his 2 children in tow. Lily was 7, dark-haired and curious, with her grandmother's eyes. Thomas was 5, already showing the quiet intensity that marked every Mercer male. They had been introduced to their grandfather 2 weeks ago, told carefully edited stories about where he had been and why he had been gone. "Grandpa," Lily said, tugging at Clifton's sleeve. "Dad says you know everything about the wind. Can you teach us?" Clifton looked down at his granddaughter, at the eager face that held traces of Eleanor and Wade and generations of family he had nearly abandoned forever. His throat tightened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I can teach you," he said. "Come here, both of you." He guided them to the porch railing, positioning them so they could see the oak trees swaying in the distance. The late afternoon breeze had picked up, rustling through the valley with patterns that told stories to anyone trained to read them. "See how the leaves move differently at the top of the tree than at the bottom?" He pointed toward the nearest oak. "The wind has layers. It moves faster up high, where there is nothing to slow it down, and slower near the ground where trees and hills get in the way." Thomas squinted at the trees with fierce concentration. "How do you know which layer matters?" Clifton smiled. "That depends on what you are trying to do. If you're flying a kite, you want the high wind. If you're planting seeds, you want to know what is happening at the ground. And if you're taking a very long shot at something far away, you need to understand all of it. Every layer, every shift, every secret the wind is willing to tell you." Lily leaned against his leg. "Did Grandma know about the wind too?" The question pierced him with unexpected sweetness. "Your grandmother knew about everything important. She knew about patience and kindness and how to make people feel loved even when they did not deserve it. The wind was my teacher. She was my home." Wade and Nathan exchanged glances. Their father had spoken more about Eleanor in the past 6 weeks than he had in the 3 years before her death. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed from a weight that crushed him into something he could carry. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Clifton reached into his breast pocket and withdrew Eleanor's reading glasses. He held them up to catch the fading light, watching it refract through the smudged lenses. "I talked to her every night," he said quietly. "For 3 years, I told her about you boys, about your lives, about everything I was missing. I think part of me believed that if I kept talking to her, she would not really be gone." "She is not gone," Nathan said. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "She is right here. In Lily's eyes, in the way Wade teaches, in the fact that we are all standing on this porch together instead of scattered to the winds. She held us together even when you could not. Clifton nodded, unable to speak. He slipped the glasses back into his pocket, where they would remain until he no longer needed the comfort of carrying them. The Stillwater Veteran Reintegration Program had officially launched the previous week. 12 veterans had enrolled in the first cohort, men and women who had lost themselves in the transition from combat to civilian life. Krause had thrown himself into the volunteer coordinator role with a fervor that bordered on obsession, determined to transform his shame into something meaningful. Clifton would return to the school tomorrow to continue the work, but tonight belonged to family, to grandchildren who wanted to learn about wind, to sons who had forgiven what should have been unforgivable, to the memory of a woman whose final wish had been for him to stay. He had stayed, late and imperfectly, with 3 years of absence that could never be fully repaid. But he had stayed. Still here. Ellie, he whispered toward the darkening sky. Finally home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.